Hey guys, it's Julesy, and I'm so happy to have you back for another video. This one is quite late, so I'm doubly appreciative that you have clicked to watch this video because we all know how fast the internet moves on from things. And I just have really bad anxiety that has been highly triggered by this pandemic and all the grief and sadness and death that I am currently surrounded by. So it has really been hard for me to get things done, particularly by coming on camera and then sitting down and editing. I feel so stuck in my place right now, and I am trying to do more, and then these braces, and I have a new band set up, and so I can't really open my mouth. And I'm not trying to give excuses, but I really appreciate anyone who's actually tuned into this video because I know this is kind of passe and folks have moved on from thinking about, I guess, this mini series, but I still wanted to come and take my time and do some research, including reading the book that the Netflix miniseries Self-Made was inspired by. And the series came out the week of my birthday. You know, I was turning 35 in quarantine, which unto itself was sort of like a mind. But I still felt it was important for me to sit down and discuss Self-Made because, you know, I love Black women history and there was so much missed opportunity in this miniseries. Now, the book that inspired this series has now had its title changed to Self-Made, reflecting the Netflix series. It was originally entitled On Her Own Ground, a biography of Madam C.J. Walker by her great-granddaughter Alayla Bundles. The book was the inspiration for the miniseries starring Octavia Spencer as Madam C.J. Walker. Now, I don't understand why the title of the book was changed to reflect the Netflix series or why the actress Octavia Spencer, who portrays Walker, is now featured on the cover of the book. So when I purchased the ebook, I got a cover with Octavia and the title saying Self-Made, which I'm just like, I don't know, like what was the point, especially if the series is going to take so many liberties with the actual story. And one of the things that is for sure a very valid critique of the series is the amount of erasure it does to the complex and extraordinary legacies of Black women from the progressive era. Now, I grew up with a maternal grandmother born in 1925 and a great grandmother born in 1904 in the house. Both of them were born and raised in Harlem, New York, and I am trying to remember who I was introduced to the story of Madam C.J. Walker by, because she was definitely someone I knew about as a child. And I am pretty sure that that was because of my great grandmother, who we called Nana, talking about her. But I have the best memory in my family, so if I don't remember, there ain't no point in asking anybody else because they not gonna remember. So, you know, asking my mama won't get me anywhere. And I really can't precisely place the memory of my Nana discussing Madam C.J. Walker, but I remember as a child, like, I feel like I had a conversation with my Nana about her, and then, like, my grandmother gave me a cutout book of illuminary African Americans, and it had, like, Satchmo and Josephine Baker and Langston Hughes and those type folks. And then I remember asking my Nana, like, why wasn't Madam C.J. Walker in the cutout? That's like the reference that I have. But I remember like talking about the way my Nana would press and curl her hair, and you know the comments that were made about the texture of my hair and the correlations to those things. But I'm not going to get too much into that. Whatever. I've long known about the story of Madam C.J. Walker because I had Harlem women from 1904 that lived through the Great Depression in my house. Okay. But let's get into this actual review because I could talk, that's a whole other video unto itself. There were and there are several reasons why I still wanted to do this review, even though it has been thoroughly discussed, or shall I say reviewed on YouTube, with me being about a month late on the review. Now, the era in which Madam C.J. Walker lived and came to prominence is a very significant point in the history of the African American community. And what's happening during that time period is where my research interests, well, they don't precisely lie, but in order to study anything about the activism and organization of Black folks, you pretty much have to go back to the progressive era. And I have a particular interest in the activism of poor and working class Black women. So for starters, the progressive era for Black folks is known as the Nadir, loosely translating to the darkest period in history, a term coined by Howard University historian Rayford Logan to address the era after the Reconstruction that broadly carries on into the early 1920s, where African Americans faced heightened domestic terrorism that was protracted by government policy and Supreme Court rulings that continually stripped away the incremental civil rights they had gained during the Reconstruction era. You will find such Supreme Court rulings. What is the actual constitutional law? I think it's U.S. Code. There's a whole book on it by Dr. Mary Frances Berry. The code that led to the 13th Amendment and that essentially ends slavery and says that no one should be forced to work. And Black people were trying to use the code to say that not only should they be forced to work, but that they should be guaranteed to paid work. And the Supreme Court ruling during this era came back and said, no, that law just means we can't force you to work. It don't got nothing to do with how folks pay you. Which is how we get into sharecropping. Anyhow, again, I could go on and on about all these things. But back to this mini-series specifically. Now I want to start this off, even though I've kind of veered off, with a quote from Professor Dr. Pero Galgo Dagbovi. Man's got a complicated name, but in his article for the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, he offers his reflections on conventional portrayals of African American experience during the Progressive Era, or the Nadir. And I might be saying that wrong because I know someone through the YouTube Critics for Change program, and his name is Nadir, and in Arabic, it actually means the light. So it's interesting that here in America, we use it to describe the darkest period of racial relations in America. But Ramadan Mubarak, one line that really stuck with me with regards to self-made and what Dr. Bagovi is saying in his journal article with regards to self-made is that knowing what we do about the copious challenges that Blacks face during the Progressive Era, it is only natural that an endorsement of tactics would emerge, many of which in their own unique ways played a role in chipping away at white supremacy hold and creating a better world for the masses of African Americans. Now, Dr. Bagovi was discussing the flattening of the conflict between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and how that conflict tends to be discussed in very binary terms in academic history books. But this also aligns with how many of the women that surrounded Walker were erased or flattened in the series, and we don't actually really get to see all the tactics and strategies that were discovered, that were employed, that were debated and discussed amongst these organizations that came together to fight against the sort of atrocities that were happening to Black folks at that time. And it's really wild because the book by Alela Bundles poignantly discusses all these things, including the women and the Black women organizing that was happening at the time and that Madam C.J. Walker was actively engaged in. She was very much so a woman, an entrepreneur who saw it upon herself to take on the race problem, and on her own ground wouldn't technically classify as a traditional history book, and I'm not positing that as a bad thing. Alela Bundles is a beautiful storyteller, and she weaves through the history of her great-grandmother and grandmother to tell their layered stories and how their history intertwined with this foundational era of African American history. Much of this history connects directly to things we deal with and are interested in today. It's not a flat retelling of historical facts. It's a lushly written story that hits all the complex notes that it would make a truly riveting television series. There was really no reason for the writers to erase the legacy of several Black women like Annie Malone, whom they turned into a stereotypical Hollywood villain, compounding that with the tragic mulatto stereotype. Now, I know this has been a hot point of discussion across social media, so I'm going to give it a little bit of attention. When I briefly attended Howard University as a theater major, the one class that I will never forget is theater history. Tragic mulatto is something that I learned about in that class, where we discussed the 7 archetypes of Black theater, and I think that's how it was identified, but I'm not 100% positive on that. Anywho, tragic mulatto was one of those stereotypes, word to George C. Wolfe. It's obscene that they would take the story of Annie Malone, a dark-skinned Black woman who grew up in very similar ways to Madam C.J. Walker, came about in similar ways and means, again, as Madam Walker, and diluted her in a way that both does a disservice to Annie Malone's legacy, but also to the story of Madam Walker. The idea that Black media or cinema has to be such basic offerings that somehow we as a Black audience are not intelligent enough to deal with more complex story arcs and characters. There are quite a few videos already dealing with Annie Malone's history and countering the claim that Madam C.J. Walker, who was born named Sarah Breedlove, but that she was the first Black millionaire or Black woman millionaire. So that really honestly isn't the focus of my critique, though I feel like that it is, a valid critique of the series. But, going back to the book, the complications of their rift and how they took out entire page ads or paid to publish stories about themselves in historical black newspapers, touting their commitment to the black community, the drama and artful pettiness was already fully laid out in the book. Madam C.J. Walker was a race woman, word of Julia Cooper, a black woman who centered much of her philanthropy around attempting to solve the race problem. And unique to the era in which she prospered, known as the Nadir, what made it the darkest era of racial relations in America is a high rate of lynchings amongst other types of domestic terrorism that was placed upon the black community. This series could have both addressed Walker's philanthropy. I'll bet they did give it a slight nod with the mention of a lynching happening to someone who she knew or whose family she knew, someone's nephew. Girl, it was like a mention. It was like a blip. I mean, it might have been a little bit more than a blip, but for the amount of work that she did around this and the amount that it was mentioned in the series, it was just very, very off for me. A lot of this work she did through the affiliations with various historical organizations, such as the National Association of Colored Women, that would be one of the organizations to go on and lay the foundation of Black community organizing. Now, instead, the lazy plot lines they chose to focus on were not only offensive to the actual history of the organization, but also to the legacy of the people who were real people who were shown in the series. Now, aside from Annie Malone, there was Booker T. Washington's wife, Margaret Murray Washington. And this is actually how they showed in NACW, the National Association of Colored Women, with the wives taking a step back behind their husbands and staying in the kitchen during the event when Walker was trying to get an endorsement or at least get proximity to Washington in order to curry an endorsement from him. There are just so many politics that could have been used in the story. Class stratification is historically nothing new. Black traditionalism, conservatism, and respectability politics as Walker climbed the social class ladder, rather than relying on the lazy story of a light-skinned mixed woman who was out to get Walker. Now, I'm not saying that addressing colorism is at all an issue, because it is absolutely something that Walker faced. And part of her legacy is built around the fact that she did put identifiably Black women and her own adopted daughter and her on and in her advertisements and on the branding of her products, which is especially notable in the era of the Gibson girl, which is cheekily mentioned in the series. So I had Chloe Jones, who is a member of my book club syllabi cohort and who's getting her PhD in 19th century Black women literature with a focus on Ida B. Wells. I had her put together a syllabus around the series and the historical markers it overlooks. And one of the articles that we pulled, well, actually a chapter in a book on the history of the Gibson girl, and it looks specifically at the identity of the Gibson girl that was popular during this era and how it engaged and impacted various communities, racial communities. And the chapter that focuses on the African American community actually has Margaret Murray Washington's name in the title. Now, the syllabus is posted on my Patreon. We provide most of the references that exist behind a paywall. And in that syllabus, which you can link to the Patreon down below, I think to make it accessible for those who can't make a commitment to the Patreon since we are in difficult times, I will have it up on the SBG Book Club website, which will also be linked down below for $1.99. Now, climbing the social class ladder while building an empire that was so rare for Black women of her time, Walker also rubbed elbows in very intimate settings with a slew of highly notable historical African Americans. While the series shows the focus on her pursuit of an endorsement from Booker T. Washington, Walker was also in touch with W.E.B. Du Bois, and through her association and participation in NACW, she had an association with Mary McLeod Bethune and Ida B. Wells, all of which, again, is discussed in the book. They don't even have to use the references that I pulled for the syllabus. They don't even have to dig deeper into Margaret Murray Washington and the sort of conservatism that she endorsed and how that fed into the image of the Black girl and the Gibson girl and all those connections. Ain't had to do all that. They could have just used the book, and I would let her see my girl Ida Barnett Wells pull up. All right, they're right. Let her see each other. They was kicking it in Harlem. They was having tea and crumpets. They might have even gone to the juke joint together. I'm joking. But it is just like frustrating because not only are these things discussed in the book, but they're very poignantly and very eloquently written in ways in which it wouldn't have had to do a lot to come up with the storyline or the way that the story could have been told and how to interject it into the storyline and how to make it interesting and what the dynamics needed to be in order to put it into film. Like, Bundles is an amazing writer. There's not a lot of heavy lifting that would have had to be done to connect the book to the screen at all. And it would have just been great in general to see great people, very important, influential, dark-skinned Black women who have been able to rise to, I don't even want to say power, but have risen to a level of visibility because of their commitment to their communities. And it just would have been very intriguing to see these dynamics and relationships shown out in the series. These are radical Black women that defied societal norms and came together and had intersecting moments and interactions that overlapped. Madam C.J. Walker divorced her husband. Her daughter Layla Walker, who was horribly played by Tiffany Haddish, had her own rich engagements with the literati of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, I'm not going to quibble too much about them retelling Layla as a queer Black woman. I don't know how helpful it is when that's not her actual story. And I just keep going back to the point that the book is so well written because it addresses how invested Layla was in uplifting the non-traditional, artistic, creative Black scene. And her parties in Harlem were well known and a space where queer Black folks could move freely. And it's like, do we even understand what it means to be a person who embraces the queer community in that age and time? And to oversimplify it, I feel like kind of does do a disservice to the actual topic. Now, I keep referencing the organizing that came out of this era. If you do any sort of research or reading on the history of how Black women in America organized, there are two places in which we were able to gather safely up into the 80s to organize against the system that was hell-bent on sniffing us out. It was the church and the beauty salon or beauty school. Now, there is a good bit of research on this, and it's not nearly as discussed outside of educational institutions as it could be or enough, but Madam Walker owned a factory, a school, and salons that were safe havens for Black women during a period of high domestic terrorism against Black folks. And sis was deep in the South with some of her shops. There is a book about the history of Black women organizing in Durham, North Carolina by Christina Green. A good chunk of that book covers the history of the, oh man, I don't want to butcher this name, but Deshazor beauty school that was in Durham. And at one point, this school registered the largest number of members of the local NAACP chapter. They really could have told a robust, enlightening story about a Black woman whose success was grand, but also whose legacy of a commitment to her race and via the business she built was connected to so many profound elements of our African American history. And I reference Christina Green's book because a lot of what Green was able to uncover with the Deshazor school and the activism and sort of political engagement that it drummed up around issues particular, not just to the race, but to the working class and low income Black community, would likely have been similarly mirrored in the shops that Madam C.J. Walker owned, especially considering the time period in which her business most flourished. Now, I'm going to end here. I don't really think it's wrong that people enjoy this. I am a person who reads these history books on my own accord, and they're not actually fun or particularly easy to read. I have an invested interest in the history that comes out of this era, and honestly, I was applying for my PhD last year, so I had a goal in mind that really pushed me forward to get through some of these books. So I think it's very reasonable that somebody watched this, and it was their first introduction to the idea that Madam C.J. Walker ever even existed, and that a Black woman could have any sort of success in the early 1900s. You know, unfortunately, I think that the series does not encourage Black folks to do the right kind of research, or that it provides them a guide towards the right kind of research, because it doesn't really give them the tools, nor does it host a critical dialogue aside from focusing on Walker as a singular success and therefore, again, reaffirming Black exceptionalism. We have every right to demand more from Black art. I personally am done with stories that continually uplift Black folks as individuals while erasing the history of the community that surrounded them, and therefore the sort of apparatuses that were in place that really allowed them to succeed, and instead just reinforces this idea of hustle harder. Okay. It was great to see Octavia Spencer in this role, in an empowering role, but it has to be noted that it is interesting who they show having sex and who they don't, because big girls can get it in too. There was a slight mammifying happening here. Quite interesting. Blair Underwood is always ready to play the ain't shit husband, but that we get a sex scene between him and whoever the woman was playing, his light skinned lover, Dora. That fits into, like, they have a very Hollywood bodily aesthetic, right? That's what we see, but there was no reference to him and Walker having an actual intimate relationship. You know, Bill Bellamy was a little goofy, but Haddish was awful. Otherwise, you know, I love the imagery. I love the visuals of it. I love the period pieces and the costume and the settings. I felt like we're all very well done, but I just wish the storyline didn't rely on gimmicks and Hollywood tropes, especially when the book it was inspired by was so wonderfully written. All right, thanks for tuning in. Check out the syllabus. It'll be linked down below. Well, my Patreon will be linked down below, and where you can just buy it right out on the Smart Brown Girl Book Club website. Again, thanks for watching. Deuces.